Halo Infinite will be a great game when it's done. Infinite released a year ago today, and its live service has been a sore subject that entire time. So with the winter update hopefully transitioning us into a new era of Halo Infinite multiplayer, where the developers will simply match what other live service FPS titles have been doing since the mid-2010s, now seems like the perfect time to reflect and reevaluate on what 343 has done with Halo Infinite over the last year. Let's start with the campaign. I don't really have much to say about it in this context because it hasn't changed much over the last year, but that doesn't mean I don't like it. I'm working on a Halo campaign tier list that'll hopefully be ready sometime in January next year, and I have Infinite's campaign in my top 3. This is far and away the best campaign the franchise has had in the last decade. The fans have had a year to pick apart the campaign, and the only criticism that has really stuck in that time is the repetitive nature of the game's linear levels. It's a valid critique, but it's also a flaw we saw in Halo Combat Evolved with its reused areas. So in my eyes, it's not that big a deal. The campaign is absolutely worth the money, especially now that we have the ability to replay missions and play the campaign in co-op. Or at least we can sort of play in co-op. While we finally have the ability to play online campaign co-op, development on local split screen was cancelled in early September. The fallout from that announcement was so bad that it more than likely caused a massive shakeup in 343's upper management that happened shortly after, and it's easy to understand why. Cancelling split screen was such a terrible move. It's one thing to delay it, even after launching without it, but outright cancelling split screen co-op limits the amount of people who can enjoy the game, especially when the next generation of Xbox consoles are still impossible to find out in the wild. On top of that, you can't matchmake with randoms online to play the campaign that way. You have to invite a friend and play the campaign online. And while we're getting gripes about the campaign out of the way, I'm personally a little annoyed that there isn't a theater mode for the campaign, and I would have loved to have some campaign DLC for Infinite right now. While we don't have any word that a theater mode will ever be a part of Infinite's campaign, we can only hope that the DLC will come in time. As a whole, the campaign didn't really change much over the course of the last year. It's simply just as good as it was when the game released. And even though you can play it with a friend online now, 343 really messed up by cancelling local split screen. Hopefully their new leadership reverses course on that decision. Speaking of things that didn't really change over the course of the last year, the multiplayer is still more or less the same as it was at launch. When the beta for Infinite Shadow dropped in October of last year, a lot of people, myself included, were stoked to be playing a new Halo game, especially since the foundation of that Halo game was awesome. But as soon as we got our hands on the game, problems began to present themselves. The armor system had very little content, was restrictive, monetized via microtransactions, and it left me completely apathetic towards the look of my character. I basically did my best to copy my set of armor from Halo Reach without spending any additional money, and I haven't touched the cosmetics since. The challenge system for the Battle Pass was also not received well at all. The challenges often forced players into modes they didn't want to play, which wasn't fun. That of course assumed you could get into the game types you wanted to play, as all of the modes were limited to a mosh pit style quick play playlist at launch. One challenge in the system encouraged players to tank in order to earn Killjoy medals, which also wasn't fun. And without a dedicated rank for the player themselves, the Battle Pass was the only form of progression in the entire multiplayer, which made games where challenges couldn't be completed, either due to poor performance or the challenge being literally unobtainable within specific matches or game types, feel like a waste of time. People immediately called for a match XP bonus for simply playing the game, which was added relatively soon after launch. People then called for the match XP to scale based on the player's performance, which we only got with the game's most recent update, a full year later. The match XP update will definitely reward players who just want to grind out their favorite game modes for several hours in a single day, but I can't help but feel like it still needs some more work. The first thing that needs to change with this new system is that the player's score needs to be taken into account. You get a small bonus for being the top 50% of a lobby, for winning the match and things like that, but you don't actually get more XP based on how productive you are in the match itself. For example, in this game, I went 33-9 in Covert 1 flag and only earned 250 XP towards the Battle Pass. In the next game, I went 13-11 and earned slightly more experience because my team ended up winning that match. If my team lost that game, I would have earned the exact same amount of experience in both of those games. I objectively played worse in the second game and yet got more experience. which shouldn't be the case. If I were designing things, I would add 10% of a player's score to the match XP for all games. So for example, in that 33-9 game, I would get an additional 380 XP towards the battle pass. In that other game, I would get an additional 160 experience. You get the idea. This is how experience works in pretty much every other game out there, and I don't understand why Infinite is any different. Challenges themselves were also heavily modified in this last update. The daily challenge for completing a match is now just one challenge for 500 XP instead of several challenges that totaled 1000. At first I thought this would be a bad change, but you get around 200 XP for completing a match as part of the match XP, so I don't think it makes much of a difference at the end of the day. The weekly challenges for Infinite were also cut in half. You now only have to complete 11 challenges instead of 21 to get the week's ultimate reward. This is a good thing if you just want the cosmetic for the week, but not as good if you're using challenges to progress the battle pass. You'll probably get a similar amount of XP when you take the match XP into consideration, so take that for what you will. In the time it took to explain why the challenge system was so hated, we also got to touch on a few more things that made people dislike the game. Playlist variety did improve over time, with dedicated playlists for Slayer and SWAT, with new game modes in playlists like Fiesta, Land Grab, Rumble Pit, Shoddy Snipes, as well as new modes like Last Spartan Standing being added to the game. Still, there's no way to jump into a dedicated playlist for game modes like Audible or Capture the Flag, and there's still no word on if and when fan favorite modes like Infection and Griffball will be added. And with the winter update, the amount of available playlists was actually cut down, with modes like Rumble Pit, Land Grab, Shoddy Snipes, and more being completely removed. While additional modes helped to add variety when they were present, we only received 4 new maps over the course of the entire game's lifecycle, 2 of which were added in the last update. Speaking of new modes, the new game mode they added with the winter update, Covert 1 Flag, is actually surprisingly great. I wasn't sold on the mode when 343 were showing it off leading up to the update, and after my first game I didn't like it at all. But after each new game, I find myself liking it more and more. It might even be my favorite mode in the game right now, if only because it's different. And because they took Last Spartan Standing away. The big problem with the mode is that for the game to be fun, you really need the right map for it. If the map is massive like Launch Site, it's going to be a slow, boring game where not much happens. And if it's a really small map with a direct route to and from each spawn, then the rounds can end really quickly. The map choice matters a ton for this mode. My favorites so far have been Aquarius and Recharge. Also, I have no idea why 343 decided to give the Covert players a Pulse Carbine. It's an awful weapon. It's been an awful weapon for a year now, and I never see anyone using it in this mode. The Covert players basically just have a sidekick and nothing else, which actually sounds terrible on paper, but surprisingly it's pretty well balanced in practice. Speaking of weapons though, Halo Infinite's weapon sandbox is virtually identical to how it was when the game launched. The lone update for the entire year was a nerf to the Mangler's melee damage. You could kill players with the Mangler after a single shot followed up by a quick melee, so the update was absolutely warranted, but weapons like the Pulse Carbine, Plasma Pistol, Disruptor, and the Ravager are still as underpowered as they were on day one. On top of all of that, things like the broken theater mode in custom games, the slow user interface, the aforementioned armor system, and whatever gremlins are causing the desync player's experience all need to be addressed or completely overhauled. Whether the issues are major changes or something as minor as weapon tuning, the updates are slow to arrive if they ever show up at all. If you had a copy of the Infinite Beta 343 Shadow dropped and a copy of the game right now and challenged gamers who never played Infinite to identify which is which, I doubt many would be able to do it. The playlist additions, the addition of Match XP, and a couple new armor cores, as well as of course Forge and the campaign updates, are the only obvious signifiers for which is which. And that's only because their absence was so obvious from day one. The amount of content pales in comparison to the live services offered by modern Call of Duty games, and while Battlefield 2042 has started to turn things around, Infinite has remained rather stagnant. The biggest difference between the beta version of Infinite and the version we have right now is of course Forge. The long-awaited, often delayed, and highly anticipated feature finally released as its own beta with the last update. To be 100% honest, I never did much of anything with Forge in any of the prior Halo games, so beyond reading the spec sheet, I can't say how much better or worse it is in comparison to prior modes. Forge has only been in Infinite for a couple of days at the time of recording, so it's not like anyone could reasonably get a good idea of how good or bad Forge is anyway. It's simply too big a feature for that. One thing I can say with certainty is how annoying it is that we have to wait for Season 3 for online matchmaking in Forge. For the next 4 or 5 months, the only way to share any anything you make in Forge is either to host a private match with your friends, or post it on Halo Waypoint or the various Halo subreddits, or here on YouTube and just hope that someone takes a chance on it. So as a solo player, I don't have a way to get much out of Forge until March of next year. So after a year of Halo Infinite, it's safe to say things aren't real pretty. Updates have been painfully slow if they ever arrive at all, and many of the most pressing problems with the game have been here since the beta. It's been so bad that management at 343 was completely restructured in September, and it's going to be a while before we know if that change was for better or for worse. 343 is talking about finally reaching what they are calling seasonality with the start of Season 3, with the goal of having a 3-month-long season next year. The fact that this is something they couldn't start the live service with says everything you need to know about how things are going right now. There's a real push from 343 that a lot of people are buying into, that if we just make it to Season 3, then things will start to improve. But we've been saying that ever since the beta. If we just make it to the full launch of Infinite, then the challenge system will improve. If we just make it to Season 2 of Campaign Co-op, things will improve. Okay, Campaign Co-op was delayed and Season 2 is nearly a year long, but if we at least make it to the winter update with Forge, then things will improve. Guys, stop. We've been here before. We haven't moved all year, and I won't believe that car is going to start until it does. We think we see a light at the end of the tunnel, and we've been running towards it for a whole year, but we failed to realize that we're standing on a treadmill. The only hope I have is that with Forge and Campaign Co-op launching, the resources those projects were taking up can be redistributed to other projects, and help push out fixes for desync, the theater and custom games, cross-core armor customization, a frickin' weapons patch to make the pulse carbine and plasma pistol viable weapons. But I won't believe it until I see it. Right now, we have a version of Halo Infinite that's just pretty good, which is more than a lot of studios can do at their very best. After a decade of broken Master Chief Collection and the identity crises of Halo 4 and 5, I don't take that for granted, but there is a great multiplayer in that game somewhere, and it just hasn't broken out yet. Halo Infinite will be a great game when it's done. I still hope we see that day. But those are just my thoughts. Of course, let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Like the video if you made it this far. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.